While I make every effort to broadcast correct information, I'm also still learning. I will double check all my facts, but realize that healthcare is a constantly changing science and art. One doctor or healthcare provider may have a different way of doing things from another. I welcome any comments, suggestions, or correction of errors. I take no money from supplement or device companies. By listening to this podcast or reading this blog, you agree not to use this podcast or blog as medical advice or to treat any medical condition in either yourself or others, including but not limited to patients that you are treating. Consult your healthcare provider for any medical issues that you may be having. This entire disclaimer also applies to any guests or contributors to the podcast or the website. Under no circumstances shall any guests or contributors to the podcast or blog or any employees, associates, or affiliates of the Boss Body podcast be responsible for damages arising from use of the podcast or the blog. This blog or podcast should not be used in any legal capacity whatsoever, including but not limited to establishing the standard of care in a legal sense or as a basis for expert witness testimony. No guarantee is given regarding the accuracy of any statements or opinions made on the podcast or the blog.
What's up, guys? It's Dr. Tim Jackson with another host of the Boss Body podcast. Epigenetics, genetics, nutrigenomics. We've heard the terms, but I wanted to bring in an expert. We're going to talk about those in more detail. We've talked about them somewhat here and there. Single nucleotide polymorphisms such as MTHFR, GSTP, COMT, etc. But I wanted to bring in Dr. Lara Varden from the DNA company. Welcome to the show, Dr. Lara.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Dr. Tim. I really appreciate being here.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about epigenetics. What does it mean, and why is it important?
Well, the first thing we need to realize is our genes, okay? Our recipe for who we are. And it is from that recipe, the DNA that creates us, how is that DNA expressed? Because in the expression of the DNA, our genes are making proteins. They are making the things, our cells, how our cells work. Now, when we talk about epigenetics, this is our environment, inside and outside of us, food, water, air, toxins, you name it, that affect that gene expression. That is epigenetics. What makes it important is that that can be manipulated, that can be adjusted, which is wonderful because it's like having an instrument and being able to play that instrument, whether it sounds like someone, for example, like a piano, maybe a 2-year-old pounding on the keys, not really knowing what they're doing, as compared to, Mozart, being able to play those keys with such tremendous beauty. Still the same instrument, who's playing it.
Right, so it's basically putting the patient or client as the CEO of their own health because they're able to make choices that can positively or negatively impact their epigenome.
Absolutely. But first they have to learn how to play.
Right.
So this is where you and I help to teach them how to do that. We're giving them that playbook, that understanding, and basically being their teachers to help them play that piano of their DNA to make a beautiful symphony.
Absolutely. And so the thoughts that we think, there's a saying, for every thought, there's a physiological consequence. So the thoughts that we think, can they influence our genetic expression?
Most definitely. Because first of all, everything is energy and frequencies. Where thoughts go, energy flows. And it is in that our thoughts create the energy to our cells, which is the basis of, part of the basis of self-healing and being able to meditate, and how people can actually heal themselves that modern medicine, Western medicine cannot understand, where many people would call miracles.
Absolutely. So most people have heard of MTHFR,
Yes.
and that's what we call a SNP or single nucleotide polymorphism. So our DNA has an alphabet of 4 letters: A, T, C, and G. A is supposed to bind to T, C is supposed to bind to G. But when that doesn't happen or the wrong letter gets put in the wrong place, that's a SNP, correct?
Yes. And for those of you, A, T, C, and G are for nucleotides. A is for adenine, T is thymine, C is cytosine, and G is guanine. So yes, there are specific combinations that they connect to. And a single, obviously, word speaks for itself, nucleotide, one of those 4 nucleotide, polymorphism, meaning a change in that. So there is that switch. And a lot of times it doesn't do anything. It doesn't change the protein that is being expressed, but there are certain changes, switches of those nucleotides that does affect that protein expression and the way that that protein, actually functions or maybe doesn't function. So that's really important. And it is these and in the history of scientific research that they have found, when you find these single nucleotide polymorphisms located at these specific locations in our genetic code, this is the phenotype, basically what shows up physically from that genotype, the change in the genes. So this is what we are building on. This is what all of genetic testing really is the basis of, is the research and knowledge that has been built on these brilliant people for decades, and learning about the genome, how we have figured out going, okay, well, this, when someone has a particular SNP here, okay, well, this could give them a stronger propensity of having Alzheimer's or breast cancer or whatever the case may be. But I will say the nice thing about the DNA company, which is why I'm a part of it, is that we actually take it a step further, because it is not so much about saying, okay, here's your genetics, here are your SNPs. You have this much of a percent chance to have this disease. Well, that's awfully pessimistic, because there's a percentage of people who have that SNP who don't have the disease. So we dive in and look at it functionally, look at your genes as players on a team and saying, okay, because no gene exists in a vacuum. Okay. And we say, okay, so let's look at this all together. How can this be expressed? How can we epigenetically manipulate it to make sure you are part of the percent of people who don't get the disease? And this is where, using lifestyle, diet, lowering your toxic load, having the right mindset, using these tools that you and I, have learned and continue to learn to help people, so that way they are in that percent that the disease.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that thorough explanation. So that's a SNP. Let's talk a little bit about the DNA report from the DNA or DNA 365 report from DNA company. It has copy number variants, it has insertions, deletions, indels. Can you kind of talk about those terms for the viewers?
Absolutely. Okay, so I think a metaphor that fits this very well is, first of all, knowing that our chromosomes, okay, we have 23 pairs, so 46 chromosomes altogether. We get half from mom, half from dad. So with these, if you think of them like a volume set of books, okay, that lay out who you are. And in this volume, there are obviously, let's pick one volume, okay, that's going to be one chromosome. In that volume book, you have many chapters. In the chapters, there are paragraphs. In the paragraphs, there are sentences and words. So if we think of the book as the chromosome, chapters as genes, and then all the information within that gene on the pages and the sentences and the words. So let's start with the single nucleotide polymorphism. So the single nucleotide polymorphism is taking a word on one of those pages and switching the letters. Well, that can actually change the word and change the expression of the gene that it's being read. So now let's look at insertions and deletions. So for insertions and deletions, we are looking at maybe a full page, a paragraph, or a full page that's missing if it's deleted. If it's inserted, then it's there, or there could even be like extra information. So, and there again, and this can kind of go down a rabbit hole, but it could not do anything. It could affect in a positive way. It could affect in a negative way. But basically, it's there, or the information is there. When we're talking about copy number variants, this could be where an entire chapter is missing, an entire gene is gone, and you just don't have it. So that specifically is used, and we look at the copy number variants for our glutathione conjugation pathway, which is one of the phase 2 detoxification pathways of the body, actually a major one, because glutathione is your master antioxidant molecule of the body. The liver really depends on that and actually makes it. So if you're missing that gene altogether, that can be problematic, and it can show up with a person not recovering very well from any type of toxic exposure or a hard exercise. It takes them, maybe an extra couple days to recover, where, the rest of their cohort or players on their team are recovering the next day, and you're like, why is it taking me so long? That might be one of the reasons. So that covers your SNPs, copy number variants, and your indels, insertions, deletions. So really, for insertions and deletions, there are a few genes that we look at. Actually, a couple in particular, specifically in the mood and behavior report for the ADRA2B gene for insertions, deletions, and that can affect the sensitization of that particular receptor, which maybe we can dive into a little bit. Also in the mood and behavior, the 5-HTTLPR gene, which works with serotonin transport and how well a person can prioritize incoming stimuli. And that works, you'll actually see it as an L or an S, which is long or short. So is that gene long or short? Is it truncated, meaning that there's a deletion, that there's a section missing, or is it long and it has all the information? So there are nuances in there, and it's really a matter of, being able to interpret, to read it and interpret it in a way to make it useful to the client.
So you gave the example of the glutathione conjugation pathway. So that would be, let's say, GSTP1 or GSTM1.
Yeah.
And so if the gene is deleted on this chromatid and this chromatid, so this came from mom, this came from dad, and if you have 2 copy number variants, that means everything's there. So it's going to function optimally.
Okay, well, I'll just do a quick clarification. So there's actually 3 genes that we look at in the glutathione conjugation pathway: GSTT1, GSTM1, and GSTP1. Now, GSTP1 is actually a SNP. GSTT1 and M1 are copy number variants. And basically, from the 2 copies of chromosomes that you have, one from mom, one from dad, if you can either have 0, 1, or 2 copies. So if you have 0 copies, that means neither mom nor dad gave you that copy. If you have 1, then it just means that you got it from just 1. 2, that means you have the copies from both parents. So, and really 0, if you have no copy numbers, that's not very good. That means you have more trouble,
So that would mean you have a deletion.
Yes, that means that it's not there. Exactly. It's not there at
Okay.
all.
So deletions on one side, copy number variants on the other, just trying to bifurcate it for the
Yeah,
audience.
there is a little bit of overlap. Again, some nuances there because deletions, when you talk about indels, you can have the gene, but there's a section of the gene that's deleted. Where the copy number variance means that you don't have the gene at all. Like, I mean, the full gene, your whole chapter is gone. Where a deletion can say that there's a page in the chapter that's missing. So again, it's kind of like a subcategory.
Okay.
So there are some nuances in there.
Okay. And so what are the primary copy number variants, indels, and SNPs that impact our detoxification pathways that you guys look at?
Okay, so what we do, okay. Can you repeat that again? I just want to make sure that I clarify and explain.
Yeah, so when it comes to detoxification, what are the primary genetic variants, indels, or SNPs that you guys consider on the reports that impact our detoxification?
Okay, let me break it up this way. So there are 4 major detoxification pathways that we actually review. And that is the glutathione conjugation pathway, which we've already discussed. The antioxidation pathway, which incorporates SOD2, superoxide dismutase 2, and GPX, which is glutathione peroxidase. They work together and they deal with mitochondrial health. They are located.
Or you said SOD2, and what were the others?
GPX. Those 2 are part of your antioxidation pathway. And actually, that particular pathway straddles your phase 1 to phase 2 detoxification pathway. So because it works into your glutathione conjugation pathway because GPX stands for glutathione peroxidase and prepares it for that glutathione conjugation to continue to break down, making that toxin more water soluble to then be removed out of the system. Because the whole purpose of detoxification is taking a fat soluble toxin, which we can't get rid of because it's fat soluble, and we have to move it through the detoxification phases to make it more water soluble, eventually fully water soluble, so it can mix with bile or serum to be pooped out, peed out, sweat out, to get it out of our body. So that's the whole purpose of the detoxification phases. So getting back to the phases. So the other 2 that we look at are the methylation pathway, which includes the MTHFR gene. And actually, there are 2 MTHFR genes that we actually look at. And this is something where the specificity of the particular gene is in the RS number. And, there's like a whole string of numbers, but the 2 that we look at end in 1133 and 1131. So for any, people who want to dive a little bit deeper into genetics to see which particular MTHFR genes we look at, those are the 2, and those really are the main ones. Then there are a few other genes in the methylation pathway that we look at, including SHMT1, that helps us to understand what type of folate, B9, you would work best with. MTRR. Actually, the MTR helps us to understand which form of cobalamin or B12 you should be taking. And then the FUT2 gene. And that helps us to determine if you can transport B12 from the gut lining into the bloodstream efficiently or not, which would tell us, gee, can you take B12 in pill form or should you be taking it sublingually? So there's, again, a whole pathway that we have to look at, not just that sweetheart gene of the MTHFR. There's more to it. And then finally, the 4th detoxification pathway that we look at is glucuronidation. And glucuronidation are your UGT genes. The 2 in particular are UGT 2B17 and 2B15. And we really focus on the glucuronidation pathway in relation to hormones and the clearance of androgens, estrogens, etc. But it is good to note that the glucuronidation pathway is actually responsible for the clearance of 40 to 70% of all pharmaceutical medications. Even though we do not deal and focus on that in our DNA 360 reports, we do in our PGX reports, which actually is a separate test that we take a look at to find out what medications can you process and do well, how, saying, oh gosh, maybe you shouldn't be taking this particular class of medications, or this one's fine, or because you happen to clear more quickly, you might have to have a higher dosing schedule for that. It basically provides the information to bring to your medical doctor who does prescribe medications. So if you do have to go into surgery or something like that, your clearance rates, which medications you should or should not be taking. Really, it's that personalization. But again, those are two separate tests, and we do take a look quite thoroughly at all of that.
Awesome. And so what, I've had patients in the past where majority of them, I would say 90 to 95% of them do very well with glutathione supplementation. What sort of genetic or epigenetic profile would not do well, most likely, with glutathione supplementation?
That would be someone who has 0 copies of their GSTT1 and GSTM1. Generally, if they don't have copies of either, they really would not be a candidate for glutathione supplementation. And I've actually have clients like that who did not know in the past, actually one in particular, who had an explant of her breast implants, and they did a glutathione IV, and she got violently sick and didn't know why. Thought, oh, maybe it was just, toxin release and everything else. She had it a second time, again, violently sick. And then the light bulb went off when we went over her genes, and I told her that, and she was like, oh my gosh, okay, that's why. So, but yet it's interesting because we've had people with 0 copies of their GSTT1 and maybe 1 or 2 copies of their GSTM1. And some of them don't do well with glutathione, some of them do. So there is some wiggle room because, again, they don't exist in a vacuum. There are a lot of other factors going on. So it's really taking a look at, what are their past experiences? What do their other pathways look like? What does their cardiovascular profile look like? Do they become inflamed more often? Or, is it something where they don't and they could handle that a little bit better? So there's a lot of other things going on. But bottom line, if you are missing copies, if you have 0 copies of those two, we do not recommend glutathione supplementation. Just the
You
precursor.
recommend NAC supplementation?
NAC, selenium, possibly milk thistle, alpha lipoic acid, things like that. We actually have a detox optimizer supplement where we have that formulated for specifically supporting this pathway.
Awesome. Yeah, I've had patients who didn't do well with glutathione. I mean, it's pretty rare. But I think one thing that gets missed is that it switches the immune system. So if it's stuck in a Th2 dominant state, it switches it more towards a Th1. So you're able to fight intracellular infections. So what some people may be experiencing is die-off from the pathogens, yeast, viruses, bacteria, cell wall deficient bacteria, and also, the detoxification. So if your drainage pathways are clogged, you take glutathione, it's going to mobilize all these toxins. Then maybe you're retoxifying yourself. So I think this provides a great starting point. Like you said, we have to consider the other variables that factor into whether or not it will work or not.
And I will say, because this is very, very important, that you should never start detoxing unless you are draining first. Well, let's back it up even more than that. Something I tell my clients, I always work from the bottom up, literally your bottom. Are you pooping? You've got to be eliminating pooping 2 to 3 times a day regularly before you even start a detox, because otherwise you are going to be reabsorbing those toxins, and that's not fun. You're going to feel like crap. So first of all, make sure you're eliminating regularly. Make sure your lymphatics are flowing and draining. Then start with the detoxing, getting them, and this is using certain, release, obviously glutathione, getting things out of the tissues and, into the bloodstream, into the lymphatics to then be processed from the liver. But having a chelator, because like you said, with the die-off, if you're not chelating and helping remove those toxins, they're going to start getting Herx reactions. They're going to be
Being a
having
binder.
Yeah, to have some sort of binder, chelator, to help, first of all, to mobilize and then to grab it and, protect it for not to be reabsorbed and get it out of the system. And this is why we really need to support our detoxification pathways, and making sure we are drinking a lot of fluids, to have our lymphatics. I mean, that drainage, that flow, and also keeping in mind that our lymphatics does not have a natural automatic pump like our circulatory system does with our heart. What pumps the lymphatics is muscle contraction. So movement, even with doing dry brushing, rebounding, just nice light, bouncing, just having that movement, very, very important. So, just heads up, people out there, please don't dive into a detox protocol unless, you've got things moving first.
And you never want to kill off more than you can detoxify, for sure.
Correct.
What are some polymorphisms? Let's talk about micronutrients and polymorphisms or genetic variants that impact those. So BCMO1
Yes.
impacts the conversion of beta carotene into retinol palmitate. Talk
Yes.
about the significance of that and why it's important for people.
Well, when you consider, BCMO1, beta carotene monooxygenase. So, like you're saying, Dr. Tim, this takes the vitamin A form, beta carotene, from vegetables and converts it into the form we can actually use, which is retinol. That can actually work into retinol palmitate, but basically, it's very important that we have that vitamin, simply because, when we're talking about what vitamin A does for us. Okay, so hang on. Let me get off track here. Vitamin A is very important for our eyes. It does a tremendous amount of things, but we have to remember this is a fat soluble vitamin. Okay. We've got a handful of fat soluble vitamins. We've got vitamins A, D, K, E. And, with these, we first of all have to make sure that we have some sort of fat with them. Okay. For people who do not convert beta carotene from vegetables into the retinol form that we can actually use. And generally you will see this if they have a G allele in their SNP, then it is something that we do recommend to get it from an outside source. Well, animals turn beta carotene into retinol. So getting it from an animal source is very useful. I like to lean in on getting it from natural, foods first. Cod liver oil is fantastic. It actually has the highest concentration of vitamin A in the retinol form that readily available. I mean, isn't it funny how, like our grandparents, great grandparents, they, gave us, cod liver oil every day. it's like, how did they know?
Right.
I mean, the science has caught up and it's really wonderful. So cod liver oil is a great source.
Mhm.
So yeah, I mean, that's definitely something. Actually, that's one of the number one things that I recommend when I see someone with a BCMO1 gene variant for that.
Gotcha. And are there any polymorphisms or copy number variants that impact zinc or magnesium?
Well, actually, there are four major micronutrients that we look at in the DNA 360 reports, and that is one, the vitamin A, the BCMO1 gene. The other one is SLC23A1. This works with vitamin C. So we actually look at that through the antioxidation pathway, as well as in your diet and nutrition reports, because obviously vitamin C is an incredible antioxidant. And how well are you converting and transporting that vitamin C? It's pretty rare that I see someone that has a suboptimal SLC23A1, which is a solute carrier gene. That's what the SLC stands for. And generally, when someone has an A variant, that is suboptimal. That means they have some difficulties with vitamin C. They will have some more issues when it comes to when viruses or sicknesses get around, they will catch it more readily, and it takes them a little more to recover. And in that respect, we do recommend that you have your citrus, get your vitamin C, obviously from your food first. But you may have to be on vitamin C supplementation like forevermore, because that is very important. And something, I know this is a little sidetrack, but something I found interesting a handful of years back is that animals like dogs, they make their own vitamin C. We are the only ones that don't. It's like, what's up with
Humans, anteaters, and elephants, if I remember correctly, are the three species that don't make endogenous vitamin C.
Yeah. So, I mean, and this is where, like scurvy, it was that deficiency. And that's why they called them limeys, because they would eat limes to get that vitamin C. So really important, take your vitamin C. But like I said, it's rare that I see someone that has a suboptimal version for their SLC23A1 for the vitamin C. So there was two. Third one is the zinc. And this works into the SLC38 gene. And the A version,
38.
30A, the letter A, and the number 8.
Okay.
Okay, so that works with zinc transport in its association with insulin response, especially during fasting. So generally, if someone is suboptimal in this, and they would have the A variant is suboptimal, the G variant is optimal. This means that what they would see is that their fasting blood glucose would probably be a bit higher than normal. That's how it would show up. So this is where we would recommend someone to have to increase the zinc in their diet. Zinc rich foods, oysters, very rich in zinc, obviously meats. So I mean, and anyone can just go in, Google, hey, foods rich in zinc, rich in vitamin A, rich in vitamin C, to get the listing. But they could also supplement with zinc. And this is where, anywhere from 10 to 14 milligrams a day, just making sure that they recognize in supplements, zinc actually, when you see, say, zinc picolinate, say it says 50 milligrams zinc picolinate, it doesn't mean that's 50 milligrams of zinc. You actually have to look at the form, because there's a certain percentage of elemental zinc in each of these chelations or formulations when they're chelated with that. So like zinc picolinate, I think there's 21% zinc in it. So, for 50 milligrams of zinc picolinate, you're actually only getting 10, 11 milligrams, in that, which actually is about how much you would need, and of course, if you're eating zinc-rich foods, that would be good to help with that insulin response, especially during fasting. The fourth micronutrient that we look at is vitamin D. And we actually look at vitamin D in your anti-inflammatory profile as well, because vitamin D is actually a hormone. It is extremely important. And the interesting thing is that there are vitamin D receptors on virtually every cell in the body. It is impactful and necessary for over 10% of all protein coding genes, and there are over 22,000 protein coding genes. So we know that vitamin D is necessary for brain and mental health, for gut health. I mean, and we know the gut-brain axis, the direct impact for that. When we're talking about seasonal disorders, as far as depression, seasonal depression disorders, a lot of that is associated with low vitamin D levels. That's why, if you live at a certain latitude or, north, of a certain latitude, and especially during the winter, make sure you're taking a vitamin D supplement. Check your vitamin D levels. I personally don't like to see my clients' levels below 50 nanograms per milliliter. Optimally, I like to see them between 70 and 100. So, because vitamin D is so important to gut health, and gut health, is responsible for your immune health, your immune system, and virtually everything else in your body, it just seems like a no-brainer to make sure that your vitamin D levels are at an optimal level. But for the vitamin D pathway, this is one where it is a pathway. It's not just a single gene that we look at like the other micronutrients. There are actually 3 genes we look at. We look at the CYP2R1, which is the conversion of D2 to D3. There is the GC gene, which is actually the vitamin D binding protein gene, transport, that it's vitamin D binding, but it transports vitamin D to the cells in the tissues. And then there's the VDR, the vitamin D receptor gene. So all 3 of those, very important, because first we need to have vitamin D3, an actual active, kind of like vitamin A, beta carotene to retinol. We have to have a form we can actually use. And there's a whole process. Vitamin D, it's called the sunshine gene because we get it from the sun initially. Those photons, photobioregulation, there's more benefits to having that sun exposure than just vitamin D. But in vitamin D's sake, in the melanin, in our skin cells, the vitamin D goes down to the liver, gets turned into D3. The storage form goes over to the kidney, gets turned into the bioactive D3 form. But it's in that conversion from D2 to D3 that the CYP2R1 is responsible. I notice, and I have observed, most clients actually are suboptimal in that conversion. And, this is where supplementation is definitely beneficial. But when they start getting into being dysregulated in the transport in the GC gene and in the binding of that vitamin D binding receptor gene, this is where we have to be a bit more strategic, because they could be taking vitamin D supplementation, but their levels aren't budging. That's generally because they might not be taking enough. Maybe they're only taking 1,000 IU a day. And they're taking it in one bolus dose rather than spreading it out. If you don't mind, I'd like to tell a metaphor that I explained to my clients about the vitamin D pathway. So I'd like to reference it like vitamin D, we're going to call people. Okay, so let's bypass the D2 to D3 conversion. And let's just get to D3 because it's easy enough just to, take supplementation. So we have D3 people at a bus stop. So now they've got to be brought to their homes, okay, to the cells and the tissues. So they have to wait for the bus. The bus comes. Well, this is the GC gene, okay? If the gene is optimal, you've got a nice big long bus that can pick up all those D3 people in one shot, in one pickup to bring them around.
Mhm.
Well, that's if it's optimal. If it's suboptimal, you don't have a nice long bus. You might have a short bus, or you might have a bicycle. So that really makes a difference on how many D3 people you can pick up and then bring to all of the cells. So the next thing is dropping them off at their house, the vitamin D receptor. You can think of this like people that are home that are opening the door to let the D3 people in. Now, if it's an optimal version, that person's home every time, they will open up, let the D3 person in, everything's great. But say it's suboptimal, whether it's a heterozygous or a homozygous. This is where that person may not be home when the D3 person gets dropped off. That's a problem. So what do we do about it? This is where we've come up with the solution of, instead of taking vitamin D3 just in a single dose in the morning, to break it up into divided doses. Let that bus have more trips around to pick up the D3 people to bring them home. So providing that opportunity gives more opportunity for the person at the house to be home, to open the door, to let them in. So, and it's also looking and keeping track of not just throwing a bunch of vitamin D at the person, knowing what their levels are. Now, it is not a marker that is generally or typically measured when you go to your doctor. You actually have to ask them or make sure, say, hey, could you add, the 25 hydroxy D test, that's the name of the blood test, to my blood test to see what my levels are. Hopefully your doctor is open enough to go, yeah, okay, we'll take a look at that. Most functional medicine doctors are very aware of this and they will include that. But it's good to know your levels. And any changes, you would have to wait 3 months, to start looking at those changes, because red blood cells lifespan is 120 days. So that's when you're really going to start seeing the differences. So again, it's knowing your genes, knowing the pathway, where you might be suboptimal, and then strategically supplementing to make sure that your levels are at an optimal level.
Absolutely. And one thing I want to add for the listeners and viewers is that when you're having your blood tested for vitamin D, you want to test both the 25 hydroxy vitamin D and the 1,25 hydroxy vitamin D. A lot of people base supplementation and lifestyle changes on just the 25 hydroxy vitamin D. But there's plenty of research that shows that, especially people with neuroimmune syndromes, that they're hyperconverting the 25 hydroxy into 125 hydroxy. So if you give them vitamin D, it could actually make them worse. The second thing I'd like to add is that sometimes it's a matter of magnesium or boron deficiency.
Right.
So those cofactors have to go with it.
Absolutely. Magnesium works synergistically for the utilization and absorption of vitamin D. And it also is something that clients and patients should be aware. If they are taking, especially in higher dose vitamin D supplementation, they want to take a K2. Vitamin K2 with it. I usually make sure they don't go over 200 micrograms daily, but even like 100 micrograms, depending on how much D3 they're taking, because vitamin D actually liberates calcium. It will utilize calcium that's available in the blood, or if it's not, it will take it wherever it's available in the body. Well, your main stores are in your bones, and we don't want it stealing the calcium from your bones. So K2, the reason why we have that is because it puts that and keeps the calcium in the bones where it needs to be. So make sure that that you all listeners, if you are taking vitamin D, to make sure you're doing your K2 as well.
Yeah, the K2 is kind of like a molecular Uber for calcium. And so it's going to pick that calcium up and take it to where it should be, like Dr. Lara mentioned, and the bones, teeth, etc. Any other micronutrients, genetic variants that you guys look at?
Not for the micronutrients, no. Those are the main ones. But of course, we do look at, as far as macros, sorry. That would be, you know, your fat, how well do you metabolize, utilize fat in the body, your carbohydrates. We look at the AME1 gene, that's amylase, the enzyme that breaks down carbohydrates in the mouth. There is an AME2 that's actually expressed from the pancreas, but we don't focus on that because really the first part of digestion is in the mouth. So that's where we focus. And we do see a correlation to starch metabolism and weight gain, you know, depending on if you have a suboptimal variant there. And then as far as proteins go for macros, there aren't any genes per se that look at the functional aspect of protein, you know, utilization. So we really focus on how it's prepared, any toxins that could be introduced with proteins, whether it be in the forms that you are taking. If it's, you know, obviously we know that a lot of regular chickens and cows, especially if they're CAFO cows or, you know, these major things that get antibiotics and, you know, have growth hormones, that's being introduced into your body. So making sure your sources are very clean, but also the way you prepare it. Anytime that you are charring, smoking, having any kind of cooking in, oh, good heavens, doing frying, there we go. That's introducing toxins to your body, which puts more pressure on your detoxification pathways, which is why we really, you know, look at all of these through a systems biology lens, because it's all connected. Oh, and I'm sorry, I did want to mention that we do look at the HLA family, which deals with gluten sensitivity, celiacs, not as diagnostic, just as a sensitivity. So those are the mains as far as macronutrients.
And it, you know, in my experience, it's possible to have the genetic variants for even non-celiac gluten sensitivity, but you may not have it. But then some people may not have the genetic variants and they may react to the gluten or the gliadin or the lectins. So is there any genetic variants that look at propensity to react to lectins and gliadins?
As far as lectins, where we're talking about sensitivities, especially for you know, in legumes and in other, for people who are vegetarian or vegan, we look at their methylation pathway, because it really is that in that pathway that is very reflective on how well you are able to handle and clear these anti-nutrients, you know, the lectins, the phthalates, the oxalates, you know, things like that. So yes, that definitely is an area that we look at. But as far as a particular gene going, okay, this is the gene that clears lectins, no, it's again looking at that larger picture, because honestly, a lot of it really comes down to the detoxification pathways. How well are you managing that? But getting back to the gluten sensitivity, you're absolutely right. I have seen people with actually a very decent profile of normal gluten sensitivity, but yet their guts are wrecked. You know, they are super sensitive to gluten. And I have found it's not so much the gluten, it's the glyphosate. It is, you know, these toxins that US, and other countries spray on the wheat products and on our vegetables, our crops, because they use glyphosate, which is in Roundup, as a drying agent. It's a finishing drying agent. So it's not just, initially as a pesticide for them to actually grow. So, because they genetically modify these crops, to be able to withstand being sprayed by the Roundup, but they use the glyphosate itself as that finishing agent. So you're getting even more on top of that. And that is what's wrecking the gut, because it's acting as an endocrine disruptor, an estrogen mimetic, which is screwing up our hormones. I mean, it's just this whole cascade of chaos that ends up causing problems. And it's not just glyphosate, it's also atrazine, which is another pesticide. So a lot of things that we here in the US use as like a matter of fact, that if you are having any type of wheat products that are not organic, guaranteed you are consuming glyphosate and it is in your system. So where Europe has outlawed it, you cannot use that at all. So because
And
I have
even
clients, go ahead.
even on some of the farms where people are, um, farming in an organic manner or regenerative farming practice, I've seen people that are very high in glyphosate because a farm 10 miles down the road, if they're using glyphosate, it's eventually going to make its way via pesticide drift onto their farm.
Yeah, even though they are supposed to have some sort of physical barrier, trees, things. And that's why if you've ever like been in a plane or even just, driving along the road, but you can see it better when you're in a plane, you have these, square rectangular fields, and then you can see these rows of trees, around, because they have to have some sort of physical barrier to kind of encase that area. But I mean, when you talk about wind and other movements and stuff, if you have an organic farm with a conventional farm not that far away, yeah, there is cross pollination in that kind of respect. Because there was a study done, oh gosh, a handful of years back, like within the last 10 years. I remember reading where they actually tested some organic wheat products, and it did test positive for glyphosate. Now, granted, not as high, but it was there. So even then, if it says organic, it doesn't, you aren't 100%, protected, but it's still better than not, lower that toxic load as much as possible.
Absolutely. So what's something you know today to be true that you wish you would have known 10 years ago?
Oh, I would say the awareness and discernment of my environment, of what I put in my body and what I expose myself to. Being in this field and learning what I have learned, and I learn new things every day. It is absolutely incredible and overwhelming how many toxins we are exposed to.
Yeah.
Just tremendous. And realizing the impact, the dramatic impact all of these things have on my body. That if I would have known this 10 years ago, I could have saved myself, some issues. Well, I've been learning over the last 10 years, even if we go 20 years ago, I could have saved myself some problems that I had, especially when I was on, a lot of medications after the car accident, and really realizing how detrimental the impact that had, and the major difference of healing that I have had since, changing my diet more, since working into having a meditation practice, incorporating quality sleep. I always had some quality sleep, but prioritizing it, these types of things. It's just amazing the way that you feel the difference. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah, I mean, it interferes with so many aspects of our biochemistry and physiology. And, ultimately people will say, oh, well, I had someone, this was 2, maybe 3 years ago. Oh, yeah, I understand there's hundreds of thousands of chemicals in the environment, but I just don't know that they're affecting us or impacting us. I said, PubMed, just type it, pick a toxin, type it in, a few thousand, at least a few hundred minimum studies will
Oh, yeah.
come up. And so, I also hear people say, oh, well, we have a liver, we have 2 kidneys to filter. Yeah, but I mean, they have their limitations, right? You can't just keep dumping more and more toxins and expecting them to work. Like they already have enough work to do without toxin exposure. So when we add those additional exogenous toxins, then that's when illness occurs.
Hmm. And it's something I tell my clients. It's like, yeah, okay, you've got these organs to help with the detoxification. So think of it like you are your liver and you are climbing a mountain. And, if you are unencumbered and, you could probably climb that mountain pretty easily. I mean, yeah, it might be a little tough at times, but you can do it. So now think of how that liver is feeling when you put a lot of toxins. So now we're going to put a 150-pound pack on you, and we're going to tie your hands behind your back and see how easy it is to climb that mountain. So, start putting it into perspective. It's like, yeah, you might still be able to do it, maybe not, but sure as heck would be a lot easier if we take the pack off and untie your hands.
Absolutely. And if people want to have this test done that we've discussed, where can they go?
Actually, they can just go to thednacompany.com. You can go right to our marketplace. Actually, there'll be a link or a little tab that you can actually go on to purchase a test. We are now offering a consultation on our tests, a short consultation. It can walk you through. And I know that we have some other specials and things going on. So, and we are changing them. And we also have some new tests available. I had mentioned the PGX test. We also have the GI 360, where we look at your gut microbiome. We are going to be offering a liquid biopsy, looking at, it's basically a cancer, a liquid biopsy for cancer antibodies, and lots of other things on the horizon. So definitely just go visit our website and take a look and give our client care a call.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time and sharing your knowledge and wisdom, Dr. Lara. And we hope to have you back on again in the future.
Well, thank you so much. And I do recommend, for people, if they want to learn more, they can always listen to our podcast, The DNA Talks podcast, and that's available on any of the major podcast platforms. And they can go to our YouTube channel for the DNA Company. And don't forget to put the in front of it. And we've got webinars and other information free. So they can definitely educate to empower themselves anytime.
Awesome. Thanks and have a blessed day.
Thank you so much. Enjoy.